Peace, everybody. Black power, free the land, grand rising, hotep, whatever your greeting is. Islam. Assalamu alaikum to everybody out there who is joining. I'm sending love. This is Marc Lamont Hill. I am the owner of Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books. And I want to thank you all for joining me this evening. I want to thank you all for joining me for this conversation that we're going to have about our beloved brother, our beloved ancestor, our beloved freedom fighter, our beloved hero, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X. Every year at Uncle Bobby's, we host a Malcolm X Radical Symposium. And every year we bring together voices, we bring together people from the community, we bring together scholars, activists, people who knew Malcolm, people who studied with Malcolm, people who are organizing in Malcolm's tradition. We bring these people together so that they can help us think about the radical legacy of Malcolm X. It is a blessing to be able to do that every year because of the pandemic, and I still believe that this is a pandemic. We have not come together in person, but we don't want to stop the tradition. So this is our 5th year doing the tradition of talking and thinking together about Malcolm X. This year it's on IG Live. Hopefully next year, this year's IG Live. Next year, hopefully we'll be back in person and we'll do it bigger and better than ever. But I do have some special guests who are going to join us as part of the conversation. And so if you're one of those guests, please feel free to join the conversation. Send me a request link, or when I see you in the room, I will request you. But we got some wonderful people coming in. We got our sister Suad Abdul Khabir coming in. We got Wesley Muhammad coming in. We got Hiram Ashanti coming in, and we have people from the community who are going to build with us. If you have questions about Brother Malcolm, come on in. If you want to go live and talk about Brother Malcolm, come on in. We ain't going to agree on everything with Brother Malcolm. We're not going to agree on his legacy. We're not going to agree on certain ways that Brother Malcolm is memorialized. We're not going to agree with the way historians talk about him. We may not even agree on his faith. But that's what it means to have these conversations. That's what it means to build. We build together and we advance our knowledge of the great Malcolm X. I want to start, though, before I bring some folk in, just by laying out a few things that I think are key for understanding Malcolm X for me. I start with my own story, as I always do when I talk about Malcolm X, because I do not believe that I would be here without Malcolm X. I do not believe that I would be in this Peace King. I do not believe that I would be in this chat. I do not believe that I would be occupying the spaces that I do in this world if not for the great Malcolm X. And so for me, the story of Malcolm X begins with that beloved book, the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I know there's a whole lot of people who 10 years later, 20 years later, 50 years later, depending on what your perspective is, think about the autobiography of Malcolm X as not entirely true. The great Manning Marable wrote a book called Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, that challenged us to think about, and I see you, Will, that challenged us to think about the autobiography of Malcolm X in different ways. And I think it's worth subjecting it to some scrutiny. The autobiography of Malcolm X is not the God's honest truth. It is not a perfect memoir, a perfect autobiography, a perfect narrative. Nobody who narrates their own experience is going to tell the story of their own life perfectly. We all exaggerate. We all misrepresent. Sometimes we do it intentionally. Sometimes we do it unintentionally. Sometimes we misremember. Sometimes we add yeast to a story. But for me, that's not what makes the autobiography of Malcolm X important. For me, the autobiography of Malcolm X is important because it is one of the great inspirational texts of its time. It's one of the great liberatory texts of its time. When the autobiography of Malcolm X is initially published, it was rejected by the publishing company. They didn't think the book would do well. They worried that it was too controversial. They worried that it would not sit well with people. And so the book, as you know, comes out the October following Malcolm's assassination. Malcolm dies February 21st, 1965. And the book comes out that October, and Doubleday is like, nah, we don't want no parts of this thing. So that's the first thing you got to think about, right? What this book meant. Second thing is the book, for me, and for, I would say, millions, literally millions of Black people, represented so much. The autobiography of Malcolm X is a text of radical love. When we talk about the radical tradition of Malcolm X, we have to start with the premise of radical love. Why? Because Malcolm X's legacy is being increasingly domesticated, increasingly reduced to a Disney-fied narrative of Malcolm lived, Malcolm was converted to bad Islam, Malcolm found good Islam, Malcolm got free of bad Islam for good Islam, and Malcolm gets killed. In addition to being historically inaccurate, it ignores the various layers of radical thought around Malcolm. It ignores the radical transformations of Malcolm. It reimagines the radical feminism of Malcolm. It forced, we have to reimagine all these things for Malcolm. Malcolm X is rooted in the Black radical tradition and became increasingly so. And the autobiography of Malcolm X isn't a full testimony of that, but it is a testament to the power of radical love and power and radical conversion. What do I mean when I say radical love and radical conversion? First of all, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is a key piece of the story of Malcolm X, and I'm going to get there in one moment. But before we get to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, we have to get to Malcolm's sister. To understand the legacy of Malcolm X, we have to understand that Malcolm was loved radically by his sister. Remember, when Malcolm leaves home, when he leaves Lansing, where does he go? So to talk about Malcolm, you got to talk about Ella. To talk about Malcolm, you got to talk about a whole tradition of Black women who helped liberate him, who helped free his mind, who even brought him to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Why am I making this point? Because I just saw someone in the chat say, well, they only saw the movie and didn't read the book. Well, in the movie, which is where many of us were introduced to Malcolm X, there's almost no mention of Black women. Black women play a marginal role. There's the sister that he wanted to have sex with, right? Who he ultimately did not, who becomes a drug addict, right? And a sex worker, which they stigmatize and demonize in the film. There's his mother, who ends up in a mental institution. And then there are his sisters who are fundamentally erased. And the only person who we understand as the guide to Malcolm's conversion to Islam is who? Baines, right? Now, Baines is not a real person. Baines is also a stand-in for Brother Bimbri, right? Who he calls Bimby in the book. But that's not, that stand-in is a bunch of people. Malcolm's brothers, but fundamentally Malcolm's sister. Malcolm was freed by Black women. We talk about Malcolm being a Garveyite, but it wasn't just his dad who was a Garveyite. It was his mother who was part of an internationalist tradition of radical internationalism. In other words, Malcolm's mom was a Garveyite. And we can talk about the Nation of Islam and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, but we also have to talk about the legacy of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA if we're going to tell Malcolm's story properly. That's also the radical tradition. So then we get from the UNIA radical. We get to the Nation of Islam, which had a radical critique of the American empire. Now, we can talk about the Nation of Islam as a conservative space. We can talk about critiques of the Nation of Islam, but that's not the fundamentally, that's not fundamentally where I'm going when I talk about today, this radical love and this radical transformation. Malcolm became Malcolm because someone loved him into this sense of possibility. The people who helped him stand up in prison, when I say stand up, I mean join the Nation of Islam. The people who gave him lessons, the people who gave him books, I'm about to bring Will Mega on in 1 second, help Malcolm to become who he was. Betty Shabazz, Dr. Betty Shabazz, is part of the reason why Malcolm becomes who he is. So we got to talk about the radical love of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and also the radical love of all of this entire community of people, so that by the time Malcolm gets out of prison in 1952, he goes in 46, comes out in 52, Malcolm is already joined by community. So when I read the book, the autobiography of Malcolm X, it's a testament of love. It's a testament to the power of learning and education. Malcolm came in not illiterate by any stretch, but not deeply read. Malcolm read the dictionary famously, but Malcolm also read many books. He didn't just read religious books. He read radical texts. He read books on Marxism. He read books on socialism. He read books on internationalism. He read ancient philosophy and he read political science. He read literature, although that wasn't always his jam. Malcolm read so much because Malcolm understood that he had to read deeply and widely to become who he is. Malcolm did not become a giant by coincidence. Malcolm became a giant because he read deeply and widely in a tradition of radical literacy and radical reading. The Nation of Islam had the same tradition. Remember, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was given what by Master Farad Muhammad, who joins the scene July 4th, 1930? He was given books to read. And the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had to read them. And the Quran was the greatest of these books from Master Farad Muhammad, but it wasn't the only book. So Malcolm is a testament to radical engagement, radical literacy to free you. As Paulo Freire said, we must read the word and the world. And so that's what Malcolm gives us. So when I bring, and I'm going to bring in Dr. Suad right now, and then we'll go to Will Mega right after that. When we talk about Malcolm X's legacy, it's a legacy of radicality. And I don't ever want to erase that. I don't want to turn him into what we've tried to turn Dr. King into, which are multicultural liberal action figures. We got to go deeper than that. We got to do better than that. I could go on and on, but I want to bring other folk in, and I'll throw my 2 cents in after Dr. Suad. Let me bring her in right now. Now, don't forgive me. I ain't the best at this technology piece. So let me see how I could. Let me see. Oh, invite to join Suad. Dr. Suad. Boom, invitation.
Hey.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam. How are you?
I am tired. I am good. And it's been a long month, a long season, a long year, but things are good. Things are good. And it's this year, last year Malcolm X Day came right during Ramadan. So that was also a fascinating moment to get people to do this. right before they broke fast. So this is a blessing to be able to do it now. For those that don't know, this is Dr. Suad Abdul Khabir, and not only is she a brilliant scholar and a brilliant curator, and y'all got to check out Sapelo Square, which I think is also in here. Y'all got to see the amazing website, Sapelo Square, SAPELOSQUARE.com, to check out the amazing site and an amazing tradition of art and intellectual engagement and culture for Muslims that Suad has put together, and she's curated an exhibit. We'll talk a little bit about that. And she's also written a wonderful book. In fact, on the ad for this event, I'm holding a copy of Muslim Cool. That's not a coincidence. This is my sister right here, and she's dope. And the book is brilliant. So if you want to understand culture, if you understand race, if you understand the context of what it means to be Black and Muslim in the United States, please read Muslim Cool. It's really a dope book. It's wonderful to read. It's wonderful to teach. And you see SapelosSquare.com popping up on the timeline. So we're going to do that. So let's get right into it. One of the things I was talking about, before you came on, was this sort of narrative of Malcolm X as a kind of conversion story from ignorance to bad Islam to good Islam to death. And I'm always fascinated because that narrative about Malcolm X is advanced not just by people outside of the faith tradition, but also by Muslims, right? Malcolm X, in many ways, outside of Muhammad Ali, is probably the most famous Black Muslim and one of the most famous
Muslims, really.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So how do you think about Malcolm X in the context of Islam, and how does this radical and also how did Islam help us think about, how did Malcolm use Islam in the context of a radical tradition?
Right. I think, you know, that trajectory you said, ignorance, bad Islam, real Islam, death. Some people is ignorance, some kind of Islam, not really Muslim, death too, right? So
Mm,
there's right. So there's a way in which the fact that Malcolm X was a Muslim gets written out of his story, particularly when people are talking about his radical legacy, right? Kind of, you know, disappears as if that wasn't central to sort of like his personal trajectory and the work and how he organized, right? Because he was both a speaker and an organizer, right? Um, you know, I spent part of Ramadan in Senegal,
mm,
actually, and Eid. And then on my way home, I was in the city of Medina Bay, which is kind of in another part of the country. Where my home was in Dakar. And they have a lot of street art, and Malcolm was there, right? There was another area where they had like this kind of almost like a pantheon of like, you know, important Black people in the world, and Malcolm was there. And I bring that up because I think this idea of him and Islam and radical tradition um, is also tied to sort of him, Islam, radical tradition, and transnationalism, right? And black identity as a transnational one as well, right? So I feel like for Malcolm, Islam becomes for the individual person, individual Black person, or the individual Black community, this kind of place where you get knowledge of self, where you sort of relearn who you really are. You've been taught, you know, all these lies about who you are. You learn the truth about who you are through becoming Muslim and through engaging in sort of deep knowledge, deep study, right? You know, we talk in his story, you know, all the books he read. We talk about that story, and that being like how he becomes a Muslim, right? It's not like, you know, I mean, people become Muslim lots of different ways, but definitely study, knowledge, education. That is a clear part of how he sort of embraces Islam. But not so you get this knowledge of self, but then to what end, right? So the point of knowledge of self is not just okay, now I know who I am, but now I can sort of understand. Now I can better interpret what's actually happening to me. I was just having a conversation with somebody, and they were like, you know, Black people need to stop victim blaming. You know, it's not the man, da da da. Like, and I was like, no, I was like having a sophisticated analysis of your of your situation it's not being a it's not you're not victimizing yourself,
exactly.
right? Like how else are you gonna have a strategy to address it if you don't know what's going on,
Right.
right? And so I think Islam then becomes this way of you learning who you are, so you can, you know, figure out what's going on, and then you can strategize about it, right? And I think, you know, his strategy was one that wasn't domesticated. You know, right now, a lot of, unfortunately, so much of our Black politics, particularly in the US, is so domesticated, right? It's like, we just want, you know, our rights here, or we want to see at the table, this kind of thing. And he was very much like, nah, like what's happening, right, to the so-called Negro, right, in the United States is directly tied to what's happening to Black people in the Caribbean, Latin America, on the continent, and all people, right? All people around the world who are struggling against white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism, patriarchy, you know, the like, you know, multiple, you know, Goliath we're dealing with.
I like that you bring that up because again, there are people who try to separate that from his from his Islam, right? And in so many ways, Malcolm's vision of Black internationalism is rooted in Islam. Malcolm saw himself, even in his nation teachings, right? The idea of being an Asiatic Black man,
Mm-hmm.
right, suddenly took him out of the context of being a Negro. And
Mm-hmm.
he said, "Oh, wait a minute, I am an Asiatic Black man," right? When they asked the question, "How many Muslims are there?" Right? What made him of his own self? His own self was a righteous Muslim. When they begin at that moment, he's no longer talking. He's not counting the Muslims in the United States. He's talking about
Right.
every
Right. Right.
world.
Right. And that's really important because like this idea, because part of the ways white supremacy works both in the United States as well as across the diaspora and even the continent is to really narrow you, right? To really sort of circumscribe who you are, where you come from, what you have done, and what you're capable of. Like that is its bread and butter, right? Like, you know, you are less than, you are not fully human. All those, like, that is like precisely at the kernel of the kind of dehumanization, right, that our ancestors experienced and had to resist, right? You know, as they were stolen from the continent and enslaved in this country and then fought for their liberation. And so the idea of thinking of knowing you are bigger than, you know, larger than, more expansive than this very, you know, this itty bitty, you know, kind of thing that you
Right.
were you were given, and then that becoming and that being and you and as a Muslim you're that way because God made you that way,
Right.
right? Like we're gonna talk about Islam like because God said that,
Right.
right? God was like, this is who you are. God identified, right, that you're all these nations and tribes and people, right? And you're bigger than that, and you're connected to that. And the point is to sort of know each other, right? And to relate to each other in ways that are just, in ways that are compassionate, in ways that are kind, in ways that are fair, right? Like this is the point of like being human. And so I think he sees that and connected that to the Black human experience, right? And then broadens it out. So I mean, I think like I was saying, this idea, particularly, I find this in kind of super progressive or leftist or whatever spaces, because I guess they don't come through with religion or they don't know how to deal with religion. And so all of a sudden Malcolm's just a Black nationalist or he's just a human rights activist. And it's like, yo, the center of that for him is Islam,
Right.
you know?
In the same way that that Christianity was central for Dr. King, it didn't mean that Dr. King wouldn't organize with other folk, and it didn't mean that he didn't have a complicated, nuanced, radical analysis that was tied to a kind of liberation theology. But King's Christianity was central to how he understood a mission of liberation. It was how he thought about a beloved community. It was why and how he understood what his work was to be done on the planet. And Malcolm was the same way, but Malcolm also, he didn't move secular, but what Malcolm did do was he said that he said, we don't come here as Baptists and Methodists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As Methodists and Baptists, we're not Masons and Elks. We're not. That's not the thing that has us catching hell. And so I
Mm-hmm.
have my religion right here.
Mm-hmm.
I have this other thing right here. He started the Organization of Afro-American Unity, model
Right.
you on the continent, but he
Right.
also has Muslim Mosque Incorporated. So he was
Right.
we're gonna do this thing here,
Yeah.
but we're also
Which is
the other thing.
an interesting move. I think about that a lot because I think, so two things you made me think of. One is, why is it that King's Christianity doesn't get eviscerated from his legacy, right? Like that doesn't happen, right? And is that, and what relationship is that to the fact that U.S. is a Christian nation, and so King's Christianity fits really well in sort of notions of American exceptionalism and America as a Christian nation, like these ideas that we're dealing with, that we continue to deal with. Like, is that part of, because along with the sanitization of King, right, and the way he becomes this kind of, what did you call him, a liberal? What did you say?
Cultural action figure.
Yes, like this multicultural action figure he becomes, right? His Christianity, because there is this firm belief that America is a Christian nation, fits really well with that, right? This kind of multicultural action figure way in ways where Islam doesn't. But also, I think, and I just lost the thought that I was going to say, so I don't even remember what it was.
It was brilliant. It was brilliant. But this connection of Malcolm to Islam.
Well, that's it, right?
Yeah.
So like the idea that he makes this kind of, he does make a sort of organizational separation, right? Not necessarily for him as an individual, but this idea that recognizing that Black people are diverse, that we come, we enter spaces in a lot of different ways, whether it's religion, whether it's gender, whether it's sort of nationality, national origin, ethnicity, whatever, right? But we catch hell because of what we share, right? And so how do we best organize it? I think that's really interesting to consider, as a strategy, right? And thinking about, and I feel like Muslims in the United States post Malcolm definitely moved away from that. I think people moved more towards it's got to be everything, like the masjid has to be the place where we do everything and everything has to come out of there, which can create conflict, right? Because if people don't believe what you believe, how is that going to work, right? Not everybody. There's definitely plenty of movements we've seen of people. I grew up in Brooklyn, and there were all these movements to clean up the streets in Bed-Stuy and that kind of thing that came out of the masjid. That wasn't about only for Muslims; it was for the neighborhood, right? But I do think there's this tension, and so I think Malcolm, since we love him so, right, and we admire him so, and we see his model, then this is also a model that we really need to think about organizing both as people of faith, but just generally for Black folks. Like, how do we? Because we have to be able to not be uniform, right? Don't confuse unity with uniformity, but the ways in which we sort of defeat, right? Or at least almost defeat or whatever, defeat. Why some of they're going to be about the ways in which we can work together across our difference,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dr. Suad Abdul Khabir, she is a brilliant professor. She is the author of Muslim Cool. She is doing the darn thing at Sapelo Square. Make sure you go to sapelosquare.com and check that out. Yo, Suad, thank you so much for hanging out.
Thank you for having me. You follow Sapelo on IG at Sapelo Square. And we have lots of content about Malcolm on this. If you want to learn more about him and his relationship to Islam and things we're talking about today, definitely check us out. All right. It was great talking to you.
You too. Assalamu alaikum.
All
right, y'all. I'm going to go to a couple more. I got Doomy Lewis said, y'all so sharp, I may not have to talk about anthropologists for a week. I give it 24 hours. That's about all he could manage with that. I'm going to bring in, is Brother Will there? I'm going to bring Brother Will in. And after we got Brother Will, we got my dear brother Wesley Muhammad, Dr. Wesley Muhammad. Actually, this brother 5%, if he has a question, I'll take a quick question from my brother 5%, if he has a quick question. I just hit him with the request. Let me see if my brother is there. If not, I'm gonna go right into Will Mega's session. Okay, I got Will here, and brother 5%er hasn't responded, so I'll come back to him. I just sent you an invite, Will. See if you can jump onto the live. There we go. Is it?
Peace, black man.
Peace, black man.
How's your brother?
Oh man, I can't complain, my brother. I'm living, I'm thriving, and I've never been more excited to talk about Malcolm's legacy. Every year, this gets more interesting to me and more exciting to me. So and shout out to my brother Wakil Allah. I saw him jump on in here. Peace, God. It's a blessing to have him in here. A brilliant author himself. If you want to understand the tradition of the 5%ers, if you want to understand the tradition of Islam in the United States, you got to read the work of Wakil Allah. He's a builder, he's a scholar, he's an author, and he's just a good brother, man. Good brother, man. We go way, way back, building with the brother back in Atlanta on Morehouse campus. That's how far back we go. So it's a blessing to have him in the building. And again, soon we'll have Brother Wesley Muhammad in the building as well. I'm sure he'll be in the room if he's not already in. But I wanted to give a chance to talk to some other folk. And Will Mega is a brilliant brother. He's a community activist. He's an organizer. And he's somebody who I have known. I was actually thinking about this morning. I met Will in the fall of 1995. And meeting Will was instrumental in my development as an activist, my development as an organizer, and my engagement with movements. There's a lot of people who will go to a protest, but being part of a movement, doing the work of organizing, doing the work of everything. Back then, remember, we made flyers. We printed stuff. I mean, we had to actually do stuff. I remember trying to get brothers to the YMCA in West Philly for lectures. I remember doing classes inside the small rooms. I remember all of that stuff, and a lot of it came from learning you and studying from you. I'll never forget. And then I want you to build, brother. 52nd Street. It was right where now is a mosque. And back then it was a bank. It used to be a bank, and you were standing there right where the OFS building was. And you were walking up the street. No, you were getting out of the car. I was walking up the street, getting off the 52, and you had in your hand a red book. And I said, "What is that book?" And you turned it around. It was Supreme Wisdom. And when I saw it,
same red book, brother.
Wow. I
didn't know you were gonna say that.
Wow. I saw that book though, bro, and anyway, that's another conversation for another day. But it was an amazing. It's been an amazing journey, man. I'm honored that 27 years later, we still building. So, what were you thinking about today as we honored the life and legacy of the great Malcolm X?
Well, one of the things that's been said about Malcolm is that when we in order to honor Malcolm, we have to honor the best in ourselves. So, it's constantly thinking about achievement, constantly thinking about how to become just the best God in myself, right?
Mm.
Um, it's funny you mentioned 52nd Street. I just left 52nd Street at Malcolm X's Park,
Mm.
and I was down there with brother Gabe and brother Umar Johnson was on stage. I built with them for a hot second, but I had to get back
Brother.
here to get ready for this. I didn't hear you, Mark.
And I just said shout out to both those brothers. Again, brothers I've known for a long time, who've organized for a long time. And Malcolm X Park, of course, and I know there'll be Malcolm X Day celebrations in Philadelphia on Saturday. And so I'll make sure I post that stuff on Uncle Bobby's page and my page. Please continue, brother.
You're starting to make me sound old because as you were talking about UFS coming to our Black Survival Self-Help and Self-Leadership classes at the YMCA on 52nd and Chestnut. And I ran into Umar today. I'm like, wow, when Umar was in college, he used to come to my new Black Panther Party for self-defense classes. I'm like, all these powerhouses. I'm like, that's dope. God has blessed me to meet some pretty cool brothers and also have been instrumental in, some small ways in your development. But when I woke up this morning, I was thinking, I know everybody does Malcolm X Day all over the world, but my studies hit me and I'm like, you know what? We don't talk about Ella.
Mm.
There's no Malcolm X without Mrs. Ella Collins.
Yep.
Just won't exist.
We just started
talking
right before you came on. I was just talking about that. I was saying that Black women
okay.
Are really the liberators and the people who led Malcolm. And I said in the film, Brother Baines is the kind of the person that leads Malcolm to Islam and to the nation. And he's like a composite character, but he's not just a composite of Brother Bimbri or Bimby, as he's called in the book.
Right.
He's also a composite of Ella Little Collins.
I mean, when you think about the women in Malcolm X's life, I see there's three things taking place. There is the genetic memory bank that exists in Malcolm X. So through his genes of both his mother and father, he's inherently a Black nationalist, Pan-Africanist preacher and scholar, a man of words and a man who's well read. When you think about his parents and where they come from, out of Garveyism, as you watch him shift, so that's the genetic memory bank of Malcolm X. And then there is this moral guide and compass. That's what I call Ella. Ella is Malcolm X's constant moral guide and compass. And Honorable Elijah Muhammad is the man who cleans him up and wakes him up and reconnects him with himself, which is a righteous Muslim. But internally, inside of him, and I hope Wesley, Dr. Wesley is still listening, because too many times my brothers in the Nation of Islam, either they don't know or they refuse to accept or have not been exposed to the fact that even the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was a member of the UNIA. Oh no, Will Mega, stuff about you can't say that. But in the book Black Power, written by Marcus Garvey's wife, Amy Garvey, his second wife, she mentions that Elijah Muhammad, and it's very hard to find this book. Google it all day, unless you got the connect to the connect to the connect, or unless you're in a UNIA, of which is still going to be difficult to find it. You won't find the book. I've had the book. But she says, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and this is zero slight to Elijah Muhammad or anyone in the Nation of Islam, that Elijah Muhammad was in the UNIA. Again, this is a reinforcement for Malcolm X, because when he's in prison, when his siblings come to him and they're trying to convince him to join, one of the things they say is, this guy, he's just like Dad. He's talking about the same things Dad was talking about. But lo and behold, the character, the moral character of the family, Ella, all the siblings join except Ella. Ella Starkworth, now stern in her thinking, very businesslike in her mind, uh, very much a visionary and independent woman, took some time. And it was Malcolm who eventually recruits Ella after he joins. This connection, this serious love he has for her, he goes and sees her when he's 7. He then goes back and moves with her. By the time he's 15, she takes the place of both mom and dad in his life. And when you hear her talk, you hear her constantly repeating the same theme. I just wanted him to become a man. She just saw this manhood in Malcolm developing, and she just sensed this energy in him. Ironically, within this, Malcolm, and I can fast forward it. We know Malcolm eventually joins the Nation of Islam, but prior to that, in the conversations Malcolm is having while he's in prison, it's not just with Bembry or AKA Baines, fictional character, but real character Bembry. He's also having a constant communication with his sister, Ella. And I thought I would share just one of those brief conversations in a letter he writes to her, Mark. He says, "Dear sister," it's a Sunday evening he's writing, "I really looked forward to you today, more so than any other time since I came to prison. Lacey told me someone had been by to see you concerning me, but she didn't know the particulars. You could never imagine how extremely important it is that I see you as soon as possible." Malcolm is like, this connect with her is serious. But what he's getting to later on in the letter is he's beginning to recruit Ella
For the nation.
from prison for the nation. He hasn't even become a minister yet. He's hook, line, and sinker. He's told Elijah Muhammad that he's got him. He's been writing back and forth to the messenger, and he's like, I got my brothers and sisters, but Ella is my mama, really.
Right. Well, that's
She's taking.
that's the key.
Go ahead.
Say, there's a way that Malcolm's liberation comes from Ella, and there's a way that at the beginning of this talk I said Ella kind of helped bring. She's a proxy for Bembry or Bemby, in the sense that while she didn't bring Malcolm to the nation, she brought him. She gave him the support, the structure, the discipline, and the love
Mm-hmm.
that allowed him to
Mm-hmm.
be able to accept the teachings, to be able to read the books, and to be able to ultimately stand up, to ultimately write that letter to Chicago, to ultimately say that he was willing and able to join the Nation of Islam. And then you're absolutely right. He then reverses it in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
It leads Ella into the nation. Now, Ella leaves the nation in 59, I believe. And that becomes another source of conversation, right? And by 5, it's an even more interesting dynamic as she takes over the OAAU after
You're stealing my thunder.
Oh, I'm sorry, but go ahead.
Right. I see one person writes, let's be clear, let's not perpetrate falsehood. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad is the most significant figure in Malcolm X's life. No, brother, you're missing it. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad is a serious contributor to what Malcolm X is. But Malcolm X, the man, is equivalent to, and for all of us, the energy and life force that exists with all of us. We are matter and energy that cannot be created nor destroyed. We are constantly just changing form. So you can't deny the God in Malcolm before he meets Elijah Muhammad. You can't deny the fact that Malcolm X used to go to meetings with his father while he was preaching Garveyism, and Ella says he would come home and repeat the sermon that Dad was given at the Garvey meetings. It was already in him. And so by the time he meets Elijah Muhammad, he's tailor-made. That's why I said this is in his genes. They aren't two separate people. It's just they were meant to be together. I mean, you look at Garveyism, the catechism in Garveyism, right, Mark?
Yeah.
If you look at, and I know you're a traveling man, if you look at some of the catechism and how one walks into their Masonic world, there's a catechism in early Garveyism that members have to learn. I'm going to show it to you one day. It's deep. And then you get to that red book that I was talking about, and you start going through the lessons, and you say, oh, my, we got catechism in Pence Hall Mason orders. We have a catechism in Garveyism. Garvey was a Mason. And then we find Mr. Muhammad
in Quran Circle 7.
Say again?
We also have it in Quran Circle 7, right? From the Moorish.
Yes.
The Aquarian Gospel, right? By Henry. So there's, these catechistic teachings are and I gotta run it in a second because we gotta jump to Brother Wesley Muhammad if he's in the building. Wesley, can you drop a note if you're in the building, Dr. Wesley. But I think you raised a couple interesting things. One, to respond to the brother, for me, it's not a contest of who was most influential in Malcolm X's life. To me, that's not even the right question. For me,
not at all.
For me, and I think I can speak for Will on this specific point, we were saying that there's an under-investigated piece of Malcolm's legacy. That there is a way that we talk about Malcolm, and we talk about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, but we don't talk about the women who brought Malcolm to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, that created the conditions for Malcolm to be protected. Malcolm moves in with Ella to help finish 8th grade. She literally saved his life in certain ways, right? We have to. His mother was a Garveyite. His mother wasn't international. She wasn't just the husband of Earl Little. She was
the wife,
a radical voice. And so for me, it's about saying, how do Black women, how do sisters play a role in that? You say, someone says you don't know Malcolm X without first him being raised by the nation. No, that is not.
Let me respond to that real quick, Mark. I know you got to go, so I'm gonna give you a few quick hits, right?
Well, one more thing. I saying that you mentioned that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was a member of the UNIA. I am going to defer to the Elijah Muhammad scholars and the archivists on that. I'd love to hear what Brother Wesley has to say this. So I'm not co-signing that point. I'm not disagreeing with it. I'm saying I have not seen that evidence. So
what? Okay.
So we can do a whole other live on that. But I'm just saying I have not seen.
Yeah, right. We can. I would love to do that. And I mean, I understand. See, one thing about when you're a minister in the Nation of Islam or a member of the Nation of Islam, you are forced to stick with the position of the nation. So you can literally write a book and say that let's say Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, was a Black man, but then if it comes back and say, oh no, your research is insignificant, you got to go back to something else, you got to throw that out the water. So where I'm coming from, you may not be able to it may not be in line with what the story is for your organization, but as an independent thinker and scholar myself, those are my studies show me. But I'm gonna give you these things real quick, going back to Ella. Again, with the Nation of Islam, with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad goes to jail, and who starts running the nation? His wife, right? Black women have been significant in these movements. We see in the current series, Godfather of Harlem, Malcolm has this great relationship with Adam Clayton Powell. Guess what? Ella worked for Adam Clayton Powell as a secretary in New York prior to even joining the nation, and goes back to Boston. So when Malcolm gets to New York, she's like, yo, I got somebody to help you out, young man. I got to connect because she was heavily involved in electoral politics, right? And then lastly, Louise Little, his mother, when we look at how we get with today, we call the final call. Yesterday, we called it Muhammad Speaks, right? When Malcolm put it together, he called it Mr. Muhammad Speaks.
Called it the final call, right? It was the final call to Islam.
That was not a newspaper. That was a pamphlet. I'm talking about the newspaper, right?
I just want to give people the origin story of some of this stuff. Yeah.
Right. But there's the reason why I'm attaching it to the newspaper, because Malcolm's mother, again, Genetic Memory Bank, was the editor for the Negro World, an international black newspaper prior to the final call, Muhammad Speaks, Mr. Muhammad Speaks. I'm not taking away from any of it. I'm just saying this was a marriage meant to be in this black woman, whether it be mom or whether it be sister, carried him and walked him all the way through. And even before he decided to go to Mecca, who financed it? Sister Ella said, listen, I already have, she left the Nation of Islam, came back to the Nation of Islam, left again, became a quote unquote Orthodox Muslim. And she said, yo, here you go. Here go that cash. Go ahead and make your shahada. And then go to Mecca rather. Malcolm had already made his shahada. He returns, he dies, he's murdered. We see her at the funeral holding it down. Right before he dies, there's a ton of sisters. There's a ton of sisters in the United States working on the Organization of African American Unity. And then by the time he's murdered, it's who decides, I'm going to carry his legacy of the organization. Ella becomes the president. There is no Malcolm X in the totality of Malcolm X without Mrs. Ella Collins, his sister.
I agreed. And thank you for that. And I love today, the two guests we've had so far. The first was a black woman who talked about the role of Malcolm in internationalism and politics and Islam, matters that often are women are made marginal in the conversation. And then we have a black man arguing that black women need to be centered in Malcolm's story. So I love the fact that on a Malcolm X Radical Symposium, we are able to kind of subvert some of the traditional assignments we get on how to talk about stuff. I love that a brother's talking about gender stuff, and I love that the sister's talking about Islam and talking about international politics, because that's how Malcolm saw it, right? Particularly, I mean, remember, it is in trouble in many ways advocating for black women. Malcolm radically reorganized his entire life advocating for vulnerable black women and girls. Malcolm speaks the truth globally about a variety of matters, but this is something that I think Malcolm was growing into and continually refining and redefining himself with. Will, thank you so much for joining me, man. I'm going to bring in our dear brother Wesley now.
All right. And I'm not just saying Elijah Muhammad was a Mason. I have the recording of him saying it himself. Well, all right, brother.
All right. Well, again, I'm not co-signing that. I've done a decent amount in the Elijah Muhammad archives in all of his books. I'm not, I've heard these arguments before. I'm not disputing them, but I haven't seen sufficient evidence to persuade me as a scholar on that question. But we'll build on that, brother. Good to see you.
I'm gonna show it to you in person.
Okay.
I know where you live.
All right, brother. I'll holler at you.
All right, peace.
Okay, I'm inviting my dear brother Wesley. Let's see if this should work. I think we got you upside down, my brother. There we go.
There we go.
Assalamu alaikum, my brother.
Wa alaikum salam. How are you, dear brother? Dr.
I am tired, but filled with a lot of energy, man. We've had a great Malcolm X Symposium. I love when brothers can come together in person, and you were instrumental at our initial in-person Uncle Bobby's Malcolm X Radical Symposium, and we've had some great conversations about Malcolm X. The pandemic has us far apart spatially, but has us still building together. At the beginning of this session, we talked to our sister, Dr. Suad Abdul Khabir, who talked about, and I sort of pushed her to think through, to talk through rather, because she already thinks through this stuff. She's brilliant. These narratives of Malcolm as ignorant, bad Muslim, good Muslim, dead, right? This kind of narrative, right? These idea that Malcolm went to Mecca, saw white people, and changed his life.
I can't hear you. Can you hear me? I lost you. Audio, I lost you. Now
I think I lost you, brother. I'm going to ask you to hold. I'm going to ask you to hold for 1 second, my brother. Can you hear me now, my brother?
I can. Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes. I apologize. I had a little tech issue.
Not a problem.
So we talked about these sort of false narratives of Malcolm. We talked about the role that Islam played in Malcolm's life, and then Brother Hiram Wilmega Ashanti just came on and talked about the role of his sister Ella, of Malcolm's sister Ella in his life, and what else? And talked about quite specifically some of the origins of the UNIA and the roots of the UNIA in the life, not just of Malcolm X, but in the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Now, I specifically said I'm not going to co-sign that Elijah Muhammad was a member of UNIA, simply because I haven't seen that evidence. If it's there, I just need to see it. I'm not disputing it as much as saying I haven't seen it. And then same thing with brother, with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad being a Mason. To me, those are sort of somewhat marginal to the conversation today, but I would at some point want to hear some analysis if there's evidence of that I'm unaware of, because I always need to see it to co-sign it. That said, I wanted you to talk a little bit about whatever you want to talk about in the 10-15 minutes we have, but really to talk about Malcolm X and the role of the Nation of Islam. We can never have a conversation about Malcolm X without having a conversation about the Nation of Islam. We can never have a conversation about Malcolm X without talking about the formation of Malcolm's politics and consciousness. And from the moment Malcolm leaves the nation to the moment that he dies, there is a very, very, very short window. Despite what the narrators say, despite what the biographers suggest, despite what Hollywood might have you think sometimes, Malcolm spends almost all of his time as a Muslim, as a member of the Nation of Islam, whether or not we agree with the theology, whether or not we agree with Malcolm's theology, whether or not we agree with his choice to join, whether or not we agree with his choice to lead, that the facts are the facts. And so we have to have a conversation about that and what that means and the enduring legacy. So who better to talk to it than you, my brother? And let me just add one more thing. The thing I appreciate about building with you is that you read the stuff. You know, I don't think I'm talking out of school to say just a few months ago, you and I were building on some Malcolm stuff. And it's like, all right, we're going to read these books and we're going to look at these footnotes. We're going to talk about what the book said, as opposed to just reading somebody else's conversation. So to me, that's always the sign of a serious person. So I'm always excited to have that conversation with you. That's all.
I'm always honored, Bismillah. I'm always honored, Dr. Mark. When I see your number come over my phone, I have tremendous respect for you, my teacher, The Honorable Brother Minister Farrakhan has tremendous respect and love for you as well. You do the legacy of Malcolm X a great service hosting this annual symposium. So to be invited to participate in this discussion, I will never tire of pointing out and showing gratitude that you would have not, it doesn't have to be me, but you would have a member of the Nation of Islam as a part of this conversation, because the Nation of Islam is so often deliberately excluded from this conversation, and we get a sense of why. There are some things I would like to say. I was blessed to hear our wonderful guests, both of them, and I was edified by it. Certainly, there are some things I would like to address that was said before me, but it just highlights, Brother Dr. Mark, how wonderful you are for allowing us in this space so that we can offer our perspective. Because in these symposiums, there's always talk about the nation, but most often the nation ain't there to say nothing about it. But you have us there, so thank you. If I could make a couple points. First, shout out to Wakil Allah, right? As you read his CV or his resume, the one thing you did not point out, because you may not know, is among the other great things that he is, he's my enlightener too. That's 5%. He brought me into Islam, right? I always tell the story. When I was atheist, I went into Morehouse Cafeteria and I saw this 5%er and this FOI argued about who God is. Well, that 5% was Wakil Allah. So shout out to Brother Wakil Allah. Let me say, Brother Will, I like your red book. I see it and raise you the blue book. Let me say this. The Nation of Islam, dear family, is not, Brother Will, as you described it, such that we Muslims are forced, I think it's a language you use, to, in words, toe the line. What you might not know, and I think your audience should know about me because of what it says about the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan in the Nation of Islam. I'm an academic. I got a doctorate degree from a major Division I university. The Honorable Brother Minister Farrakhan didn't say, Brother Wesley, I want you to come to Chicago so I can stifle you, so I can put a intellectual straitjacket on you. He said specifically, I'm bringing you to Chicago to free your scholarship, because he knew the politics of academia was imprisoning my scholarship. And he brought me to Chicago explicitly to free my scholarship. Notice, Brother Dr. Wesley, I don't interfere with you and your thinking. He teaches me and he teaches us. But the Nation of Islam is a nation of freedom, justice, and equality. Brother Will, you presented a false stereotype. I don't know if you have come through the ranks of the Nation of Islam under the leadership of the Honorable Brother Minister.
He has. That I can say he has.
So you and I need to talk about your experiences, because the experience you quoted is absolutely not my experience, and I work directly with and under the Honorable Brother Minister Farrakhan. His intent in bringing me to our national headquarters was to not imprison my thinking or my scholarship, but to liberate it. And my body of work, my scholarship, that is a matter of public record, is proof. And I produce my scholarship on behalf of my nation with the blessing of the Honorable Brother Minister Farrakhan. So that is a very warped representation of the nature of the Nation of Islam vis-a-vis intellectual integrity. I would say regarding the claims of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and then I will close my opening comments with the discussion on Malcolm X. But since the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's organizational beginnings was speculated on, let me say what I understand. When you put it, Brother Will, like you did, as if the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's relationship to the Honorable Marcus Garvey is a taboo subject for Muslims, you again misrepresent the spirit and the posture of the Nation of Islam, because it is a part of our open doctrine, the tremendous love, admiration, and respect that the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad had for the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. He tells us that, and that's a part of us, our FOI and M.G.C training. It's not a taboo subject. It's an open reality how the Honorable Elijah Muhammad loved, honored, and saluted the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. That quote that was offered from the book Black Power did not establish that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was a member of the UNIA. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad also had tremendous respect and love for the Honorable Noble Drew Ali. Member of his followers became followers of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He was not a member of Noble Drew Ali's temple. I understand our brothers of the Moorish Science Temple, some of them make that claim, but that is not a true claim. But nevertheless, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had tremendous love for Noble Drew Ali. So to present the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's relationship to these men as if it is a taboo subject among Muslims is being very disingenuous. Now,
because I want to connect that thread here, because some people might be saying, well, this is supposed to be about Malcolm X. Why are we going here? Part of it is because of how people establish the genealogy, not just of Malcolm, but of Black Islam in the United States. I think that it is indisputable that there is Black Islam in the United States that precedes the nation. However, it is also, I would argue, nearly indisputable that Black Islam reaches its maturity and its growth under the Nation of Islam. And what people often will say is, well, if Malcolm is a teacher of the UNIA and Elijah Muhammad was a teacher of the UNIA, a student of the UNIA, excuse me, they're both students of the UNIA and Garvey, or of the Ahmadiyyas, or of the Moorish Science Temple. I've heard all those arguments made, and the same argument made about Fard Muhammad. Then what ends up happening is the through line, it sort of skips past the nation as formative. And so we end up making an end run around the Nation of Islam as a formative space for Malcolm X or for Islam in America, because it's like, well, we already had this nationalist organization with the UNIA, and we got this we got Islam with Ahmadiyya and Noble Drew Ali. So we don't need we almost don't need the nation, and that
But
becomes part of
the critical point. Brother Will mentioned the catechism of UNIA as if to say that this is a replica. The only similarity in the catechism of the Nation of Islam and the catechism of the UNIA is the format. Nowhere in the UNIA's teaching is the black man God. Nowhere in UNI's catechism is the 24 scientists or the author of the Holy Bible and Quran. Nowhere in the UNI catechism is the origin of the white man identified as being created by a black god named Yaqub. The distinguishing quality of the Nation of Islam, which separates it from the UNIA of the Honorable Brother Marcus Garvey, whom we love and salute, and what separates it from the more science temple of Prophet Noble Drew Ali, whom we love and respect. We may have similarities in headwear, we may have similarities in structure, but where the rubber hits the road, none of them have the theology of the Nation of Islam, which means none of them have the sacred science of Islam, the verifiable body of knowledge of Islam that Master Fard Muhammad deposited in the most honorable Elijah Muhammad. Noble Drew Ali did not have it.
So I'm going to pivot you, brother, just so we can, because I want to hone in on Malcolm and his relationship to these teachings, right? Because if we use as a springboard even the catechisms, right? You know, my name is W.F. Muhammad. I came to North America by myself. That's a particular type of narrative. Who is the original man? The original man is the Asiatic black man, the maker, the owner, the cream of the planet Earth, civilization, the God of the universe, right? This type of language places Malcolm and many black Muslims in the mid part of the 20th century within a global context. For me, this global context, thinking of Muslims, right? How many Muslim sons are there in North America, right? We're beginning to think outside the context, not just of a Negro, but outside the context of America. We often celebrate Malcolm's internationalism, but we see the internationalism as a product of the trip to Mecca, as a product of the trip to Egypt, as a product of the trip to West Africa. How does the Nation of Islam play into Malcolm X's international politics, both at the level of theology, right, i.e. these lessons in supreme wisdom, etc., but also at the level of the nation's politics?
Yeah. Malcolm's internationalism is in the popular narrative, which I describe as the false narrative of Malcolm X. His internationalism is most often predicated upon his post-Nation of Islam travels throughout Africa in the Middle East. But 6 years prior, in 1959, when Malcolm went to Mecca in 1964, he sent a letter back. That letter was printed in the New York Times. And this is how we know of Malcolm's experience in Arabia in 1964. In 1959, as an ambassador of the Nation of Islam and the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm was sent to the Middle East. He was sent to Africa. His internationalism occurred as a representative of the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And when he was in Arabia, he could not get into Mecca.
Right.
He was in Riyadh, and he sent a letter back from Riyadh. And we have Malcolm's letter. Just like we have his letter from Mecca in 1964, we have his letter from Riyadh, Arabia in 1959. So his internationalism was birthed as a representative of the Nation of Islam. His teacher, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, sent him to Africa in the Middle East. So to start to predicate his internationalism on his post-Nation of Islam trip is very disingenuous, because his internationalism began as a representative of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And before we conclude, I want to make a point. I want to weigh in on that argument that took place over the Elijah Muhammad argument.
Okay, we gonna go there. Don't worry. We gonna extend the time, right? That's what God can do, right? So
that's what God can do.
When Malcolm gets to Mecca, and I'm asking this partly because someone is raising this question in Brother QID3 says, wasn't Malcolm embarrassed because he didn't know the traditions? There is a moment where Malcolm talks about, and this is important to talk about in the autobiography, sort of the difference between the nation's forms of prayer and the nation's understanding of Islamic etiquette, and what we understand as what will be called traditional Islam. And this is an interesting point. And I actually laugh to myself when I watch these depictions of Islam, like, for example, One Night in Miami and these other films where they have Muhammad Ali and Malcolm praying in ways that honestly the nation didn't even pray at that time. So the question for me is, to what extent is Malcolm's engagement with the second trip, 1964, not the 59 trip, but 64, where he goes to Gaza, where he goes to Arabia, where he goes to, Egypt. To what extent was that not an awakening, but certainly an opening up of how to understand Islamic practice different and Islamic theology different? Because he absolutely no longer believes in one of the fundamental claims of the nation's theology and theodicy, right? Which is that Master Farah Muhammad, that Allah appears in the person of Master Farah Muhammad in 1930, to use Minister Farrakhan's language, to intervene in our affairs, and becomes the person who teaches the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and prepares this nation, right? When Malcolm in his autobiography says, the movie has him seeing Elijah Muhammad, but in the text he sees when he is in a form of sujood, or when he's prostrating, he sees Master Farad Muhammad. Later on, he would say that he was a faker, that the tradition was fake. So I know I'm asking a couple things at once. One, help me think about Malcolm's reimagination of Islam, or shift in how he understands Islamic theology and practice, and also help me understand how we can reconcile a Malcolm who we believe to be sincere, right? Who we say, I saw Master Farad Muhammad. I had what we would call a theophany, and then later on say, I don't believe this. How can we reconcile that as people who love and follow Malcolm? How can we reconcile that as Muslims? And how can we reconcile that as people who are trying to just tie history together in an honest way?
So when Malcolm X was sent by the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad to the Muslim world in 1959, preparing the way for his teacher to make Umrah, which he subsequently did. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad made Umrah to Mecca. When he returned, a couple of things happened. One, the temple, this was 1959, 1960. One, the language mosque replaced temple throughout the nation. Also, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad prepared a prayer book, an instructional prayer book. Malcolm knew how to pray. I do understand that part of Malcolm's Pauline experience on the road to Mecca involved Dr. Sarabi, the influential Egyptian, teaching him how to pray. Dr. Sarabi happens to be the man described in the press as the man who tamed Malcolm X. Who tamed Malcolm X. It was Dr. Sarabi who made it possible for Malcolm to make Hajj in 1964 because Malcolm had to be cleared at Jeddah. Malcolm would not have been admitted into Mecca except Dr. Sarabi convinced the inquisitors that he was a true Muslim. Malcolm had to present himself as a new true Muslim. So part of his, with due respect, feigned Pauline experience was this episode of prayer. But Malcolm knew whites were in Mecca, and he knew and taught on the racist white Muslims. And Malcolm knew the principles of prayer. Malcolm was a brilliant man. See, the one thing about Dr. Manny Marable's text, and I have a tremendous number of problems.
Right. Me too.
Dr. Manny Marable's text.
We got different problems with it, but we both got problems with it.
Right. And one thing that I do concede, which most are inflamed about, the idea of conscious reinvention, that is true. Not to say that Malcolm does not experience bona fide transformations along his journey, evolutions, he does, but Malcolm also was very brilliant, very wise, intellectually and streetwise. And there are some conscious reinventions in his journey. And the Pauline experience in Mecca, under the tutelage and likely counsel of Dr. Sarabi, is one of those. So that's one.
Well, let me push you on that, brother. How do we? Because the opposite perspective on that, and I'm not just playing devil's advocate. I'm inclined to take this position, but I'm saying would be, why are we deciding that that's the falsehood and not him seeing Master Farad Muhammad in prison?
I didn't speak on that. I don't weigh in on that. I would not argue what he said it. I don't know whether he saw it or not. So that is a non-factor to me.
Well, I'm using that more as an example to say that it seems to me that people have different camps for Malcolm, right? And some people believe that everything he said until he was Mecca was a lie, and then he started telling the truth. And other people say everything was the truth till he got to Mecca and became tamed by
I'm not that simplistic.
Right.
I'm not such a simpleton.
Fact, I know. But this is for my audience.
So if somebody wrote a journal article seeking to make the case that Malcolm's theophany in prison, when he saw Master Farad Muhammad, had a political agenda, it was to whatever, I would not write an enraged follow-up response to that article. I don't know. And however the facts would weigh on that, I would follow it and see what it says. Malcolm is a great man. Malcolm's, in his strengths and in his wounds, are tremendous lessons for me, as for all of us. The arm wrestling, if I can close on. So in other words, I have looked at the Pauline experience of Malcolm. I've looked at that closely. So I'm confident speaking on that. I have not given his prison theophany any intellectual effort. So I'm all ears to anyone who has scrutinized it with any measure of rigor. And I'll listen to what you have to say. But whatever happens with that does not change the fact for me that the Pauline experience was an example of Malcolm's political savvy. He was very savvy politically. And that's what that was about. And it was successful. So Malcolm knew, as the Muslims knew, the ritual of prayer. Malcolm knew white Muslims in Arabia. He saw them in 1959. He knew.
Was the nation practicing it though at that time? And this is, I'm asking not to challenge, but to really understand, because my understanding is through the 1950s and really even longer, even though people had access to those rituals, most people stood in a position of dua. Most people didn't go through sajda, they didn't go through ruku, they didn't go through all the kind of procedures of prayer. That wudu looked different. That for a long time, Ramadan was still celebrated in December rather than during the lunar calendar, you know, Shahr Ramadan after Shaban. That all of these things that was part of a kind of global ummah didn't hit the nation until years later. And that Malcolm, while he may have had technical access to those resources, may have been more representative of the rank and file who were simply practicing Islam the way that the nation had practiced it since the 1930s.
In the way we practice it today, be real clear.
Okay.
Be real clear. The rituals of the global ummah, we in the Nation of Islam now and then, we love the Muslim world. But this is explicitly a new Islam. When the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad gave us access to prayer, he did not require it of his followers then or now. We follow it. We can practice it, but it's not our religious mandate. Our way of prayer, and I heard the Honorable Brother Minister Farrakhan say that he was with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad when prayer time came. He didn't get up from the table, stop what he's doing to make prayer. We respect that tradition, but we are not beholden. Don't get it twisted. We were not then, and we are not now beholden to the traditions of the global ummah. We love the global ummah, so we are happy to participate in Ramadan with you. We are happy to participate with Jummah on Fridays with you. We have a national imam. Shout out to Imam Sultan Rahma. And he leads Jummah at our national headquarters every Friday. And Muslims from different communities come and participate. We love that, but we are not beholden to any tradition of the Muslim world. So when the Honorable Elijah Muhammad came back from Mecca in 59, and he sent the prayer book out, that was not mandating Muslims in the Nation of Islam to pray like that. And it's not mandated today. We love the Muslim world and the traditions, many of them, not all of them, of the Muslim world, but we are not beholden to them.
So then that brings
to Islam.
So then that brings me, and we're gonna have a different IG Live about what it means to be beholden to those traditions as Muslim, because at some point, the question for me would be, then what makes a Muslim, right? If it's not, is it Tawheed, right? Is it this idea of the oneness of Allah? Is it the Shahadatain? Is it the oneness of Allah and the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Is it salat? Is it zakat? Is it hajj? Is it psalm? Is it fasting? What are the things that make a Muslim? And if it's not those things, then the question would be, what would that be? And what then binds someone from the nation and someone from the Ansar Allah community and someone from the Ahmadiyya and someone who identifies as Sunni or Shia or what have you? But that's a different conversation, and I want to have it. I really do, because I'm fascinated by it. You know, I'm always fascinated by this.
Now, I'm anxious to have it.
But the question that would be for me with regard to Malcolm would be this question that you framed quite interestingly, right? Which is the quote of someone saying that Malcolm was tamed once he gets to Mecca, or once he's in
to Mecca. That was that was necessary for his entry to Mecca.
Right. So there are many of us who identify with Malcolm as being the kind of steward of the Black radical tradition for us, right? And for me, Malcolm is at his most radical on February 21st, 1965. He is, and I'll tell you why. And you're going to disagree with at least half of what I'm saying. And I want to give you plenty of space to answer this. For me, Malcolm is at his most radical when he leaves the nation for a few reasons. Let me be clear. I'm not saying he's radical because he left the nation. I'm saying he's radical at the moment that he leaves the nation. For a few reasons. One, I think that he embraces a more sophisticated critique of whiteness, right? People like to think that Malcolm threw away the idea that white folk were devils when he left the nation. Again, that he threw away bad Islam and embraced good Islam. As you brilliantly put it, we're not that simplistic. Malcolm didn't stop saying white people were devils. What Malcolm did, even in that letter, as you know, was make a claim, maybe a claim about the ontological evil of white. In other words, he was saying that white folks, y'all still the devil. But Malcolm's embrace now was like, I don't believe in Yaqub anymore. And I might not believe in this sort of theodicy of Yaqub and grafting, but I do believe that white people have been constructed in a certain way, and that whiteness itself is a construct that has made white people a certain thing, and that there is a pathway out. Now, you could argue the nation had that same argument with Muslim Son, so I don't want to reduce this, oversimplify the nation's arguments either. But my point is, Malcolm now to me was understanding that there was an ability to understand and embrace white people, not just because they were white and because we like white people, but because they have to be committed to almost killing whiteness, to destroying whiteness. What all the critical race theorists and all the whiteness theory people talk about now, Malcolm was talking about back then, and Du Bois was talking about it before then. Malcolm, for me, was at his most radical because he was now embracing an internationalist politics. He goes to Gaza in 1964. He writes a piece in the Egyptian Gazette called On Zionist Logic. So he's starting to connect dots. He's seeing what's happening with Lumumba. He's seeing what's happening with Gamal Abdel Nasser. He's seeing what's happening in the States. And he's saying, we got to make some connections here, not throwing away the nation at all, right? Because again, he was already an Asiatic Black man. He already had a global vision. But now it seemed to me that he was honing in on that even more, and that being outside the nation, it allowed him to also reject, and I think you would agree with this, the nation's conservatism. I don't think you would disagree with the nation as a conservative organization in many ways. And Malcolm would say, I think—
What sense, if you would?
I would say in terms of, certainly culturally, I think the things that I would identify as conservative, actually I would say conservative in two ways. I would say one around, like, for example, if you and I were to talk about gender politics, if you and I were to talk about sexual identity, and I'm not saying Malcolm was where I am, but what I'm saying is the nation is conservative in those ways. I would also say the nation is conservative in the sense that the nation has an actual investment in capitalism in a way that the nation is not anti-capitalist. The nation is saying, get your own, build your own, do for self, accept your own, and be yourself, to build and construct a vision. That's an American capitalist vision, anchored by Black folk. And I'm saying, I think Malcolm was moving much more toward a socialist vision of—
I agree, totally.
Yeah. So for me, Malcolm, at the moment that he leaves the nation, isn't being, tamed at all. I think Malcolm is at his most free and his most radical, and perhaps his most dangerous. And I think that's why he had, in many people's minds, to go. I want to give you a chance to respond to that, brother.
Yeah. First, I want to be real clear. Tamed is absolutely not my language or description.
Right.
It's very important. This comes from the Washington newspaper of January of 1964, right after Malcolm left. The article title is "The Man Who Tamed Malcolm is hopeful. That's the title of the article. Now,
Yep.
what's important about this article is they quote Malcolm in it saying Sarabi, he crediting Sarabi for teaching him Islam. So
Right.
Malcolm had every opportunity to check. Malcolm was not adverse to checking the media for misrepresenting anything. Malcolm didn't check this article. Malcolm's relation, and nor did Dr. Sarabi come out and say no. So be real clear, Wesley Muhammad is not saying Malcolm was tamed by Dr. Sarabi. This headline said Malcolm was tamed by Dr. Sarabi, and then this very article, Malcolm credits Dr. Sarabi with teaching him Islam. So I agree. I don't, what you have presented in your last piece, I can't find much that I disagree with. Malcolm absolutely was leaning towards socialism. And I'm suggesting, and in my book, I'm documenting that it was that leaning towards socialism that got him murdered. It was not his talk of the domestic life of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad that got him murdered. You mentioned the Zionist logic. I am arguing that as Martin Luther King's Riverside Church speech beyond Vietnam signed his death warrant, Dr. Martin Luther King. Malcolm's article, written in the Egyptian paper, the paper of Israel's enemy, Abdel Nasser, that article, Zionist logic, also triggered Malcolm's death. The Zionist Israel's fingerprint is discernible in the assassination of Malcolm X. So I don't disagree with even you saying that Malcolm's radicalism versus the Nation of Islam's conservatism resulted after he left. As radicalism is most often defined in these conversations, I don't have a problem with that. Radicalism is usually defined or identified with leftist politics, and we are not leftists. We are conservative culturally, and we do not apologize for that. We are not democratic liberals.
That is true.
We are not, and we will never be democratic liberals. We don't vote, but let's be real clear. We don't invest in, some of us vote.
Of course.
That many, I voted for Obama first time, not second time. And anyway, I digress. But the point I want to make, to the point of conservative versus radicalism, because we don't want to be confused with, if you put with the liberal left, because when you put us in that box, you expect us to behave in that way. And when we don't, you act disappointed. But the fault is yours. We never postured as democratic liberals. That is not how we do. If you were to put a gun to my head and force me to vote Democrat or Republican, I likely would not vote Democrat if I had to vote principles. Now, the Republicans are overtly racist. The Democrats are clandestinely racist. So it's a matter of pick your poison. But I digress. What you described or what you've identified as Malcolm's radicalism, I don't disagree with. And that radicalism that he developed did put him at odds with ideological odds with the Nation of Islam. And ultimately, I'm arguing in my book, an aspect of that radicalism is what sabotaged the reconciliation efforts that absolutely were engaged in before he died. Malcolm X and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad were engaged in peace talks, were attempting reconciliation, but what ultimately sabotaged that effort was Malcolm was committed to armed struggle. And he was not willing to disavow the armed aspect of his struggle. And the Nation of Islam, it is against our religion to invest in arms like that. So at the end of the day, the reconciliation between father and son was sabotaged because of the radicalism that Malcolm absolutely developed into.
That's a fair point. And to be clear, I actually, and again, this is a point of disagreement. I don't think Malcolm X's death is a long and complicated conversation that we've taken up before and that we're going to take up again. I don't think that Israel's fingerprints are on Malcolm X's death at all. I think
that's why I write in my book.
Right. If you could look, I'm open to read anything, but I can't see that. I think this was very much a domestic matter. But I
shout out to brother Dimitri Muhammad, who was the first one to shine light on this very explosive.
Oh, it's definitely explosive, and it's going to bring you some critique, and people are going to say he's scared to say. It's not that. I have no problem offering critiques of Israel. I've taken some heavy hits for that, and I'm always willing to speak the truth. But I actually don't think obviously you are correct that Egypt had a very contentious relationship with Israel, particularly after the Suez Crisis of '56. There's also there's all the way to the 1967 war. You see a very intense, contentious relationship. Of course, Malcolm didn't get to see that, but Malcolm was in Gaza when it was still controlled by Egypt, so through the Sinai. So it was a very interesting. It's a very interesting conversation about that relationship. But what I think for me, it's not Israel or any particular country, but rather that Malcolm was beginning to develop a radical politics and connecting dots across the globe for what oppression looks like. Think about November of '63 when he gives a message to the grassroots, a kind of response in a way to the March on Washington speech, where he's like, y'all trying to integrate toilets. Y'all think about the wrong thing. He talks about Bandung, right? He's talking about revolution, war, as you pointed out. Malcolm believed in armed struggle and armed resistance and armed self-defense in a way that put him at odds with the nation. For me, all of that creates a climate. All of that creates an environment where Malcolm was vulnerable. I think it made him vulnerable to people inside the nation. I think it made it vulnerable to people to head scratching, handkerchief head Negroes out in the civil rights movement. I think it made him an enemy to white folk. I think it made it an enemy to the U.S. government. He was already an enemy to the FBI and CIA. I think Malcolm had so many targets on him that we have to think about him as that kind of figure, right? Who could have been killed by a whole lot of folk. That said, and I'm not talking about who pulled the trigger. I'm talking about who orders the hits, right? And then on top of that, though, there's this fundamental question. And I know you, like you said, I'll give you the last word because before we go, brother, you're not saying that you didn't say that Malcolm was tamed, but I guess my question for you would be that I was asking somewhat provocatively: was Malcolm freer? He certainly was more radical when he left the nation. But then if he was more radical and offering a more authentic voice, was Malcolm totally owning and accepting the brilliance that he got from the nation, the training and discipline he got from the nation? The nation saved his life. But was it time for him to leave the nation?
I thought you were going to ask a different question. Was he free?
What do you think I'm going to ask? Because that's probably a better question. Whatever was going on in your head was probably better.
What was it time for Malcolm to leave the nation? And then the first question you asked, was he freer?
Yes.
let me answer the first one, the second one briefly. You know, I and we lament Malcolm's departure from the Nation of Islam. I would not say it was time. It was not time, in my opinion, for Malcolm X to leave the class of God that he was such a premier student in. Had he stayed in the class, Malcolm X would be bigger than even the Malcolm X we are honoring today. So no, I would not say it was time for Malcolm to leave. Now, was he freer? Well, of course. And this is why I say in closing, you know, I really, if I can be candid, I shouldn't feel this way, but I'm growing, right? I get annoyed often listening to people talk about Malcolm. Because now anyone can read books and talk about Malcolm, but there's an aspect of Malcolm's experience that, except you have been a registered FOI, you are absolutely incapable of appreciating the dynamic that played out between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. There is no clear example. It's how the public handles the chickens coming home to roost. See, Carl Levin says, and I think Manny Marble says it too, that Malcolm, in saying what he said, was being free. Malcolm was being flagrantly disobedient. Now, if you don't have the experience of the structure of the Nation of Islam, you can't appreciate that. You think this is one man who's being intellectually free. And so you enjoy your freedom. But Malcolm was a member, an official under the law, an enforcer of the law of the Nation of Islam. So when he was given 3 times an instruction that every member of the Nation of Islam was given, and he flagrantly violated it, and then according to our law, he was penalized for it, and what he experienced, what he suffered in his mind about himself, thinking about why he flagrantly violated his teacher like that. And then we have his writings following that, lamenting the mistake he made, admitting and lamenting the mistake he made. But if you've never walked this walk, if you've never submitted yourself to the Nation of Islam, you have no appreciation of this dynamic, and you are incapable of judging it. So Malcolm was free because there's laws and structure in the Nation of Islam, and all of us are free to violate the laws, to violate the structure. We got that freedom, but there's a penalty to pay so long as we stay here. But if you are out there and you don't submit yourself to this structure, you got all the freedom without the penalties.
That makes sense to me. Brother Dr. Wesley Muhammad, I could talk to you for hours, man.
Likewise, dear brother Dr. Mark.
We're gonna do this again. And you know, I'm gonna end up calling you. We're gonna talk about this for some more time. But
let's do it.
Let's do it, brother. Look, I love you, man. I'm so happy to have you on the phone. Happy to have you in the chat here today, and just thank you for building with me, especially on short notice, my brother.
I love you. Keep up the great work.
You too, my brother. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Everybody, that's going to bring us to the end of this Malcolm X Day Symposium. I want to leave you all just with some quick thoughts, and I mean like seconds, not minutes here, which is we got to make Malcolm's words flesh. We got to make Malcolm's words action. Malcolm wasn't just about reading, though Malcolm read deeply and widely. Malcolm was about taking those words and putting them into action. That means organize. Organize doesn't mean you got to start something. Organize means you can join an organization. You can fortify an organization. You can build. You can sacrifice. Malcolm was, it remains, you know, a legend to us. But Malcolm's primary assignment on this planet was as a national assistant, a student minister, a teacher who was teaching people what was still being taught by somebody else. And the legacy of Malcolm is radical action don't mean you got to be the president and the CEO and all these fancy Negro titles. It means that you join the movement and you organize and you build with the people and for the people. Malcolm's legacy is being willing to speak the truth, though it may be bitter. That means that when you make people unhappy, when you do things that disqualify you from opportunities, from jobs, from social networks, you still do it because the truth and justice demands our honesty. To be honest and act in the radical legacy of Malcolm X, we cannot deny the role of Black women. We cannot deny the role that Black women played in the formation of Malcolm X and the strengthening of Malcolm X and the support of Malcolm X and the carrying on the legacy of Malcolm X. We cannot do that when we talk about Malcolm, and we cannot do it in our current organizations. We must continue to build. To be in the legacy, the radical legacy of Malcolm X, we must have an international vision. We can't just be here in the United States thinking about catching hell right here. It doesn't mean we don't focus on our local communities. It doesn't mean we don't focus on home. We got to focus on home. But to understand Malcolm's legacy is to understand that the reason home is on fire is because of a global arrangement, a global set of power structures, a global commitment to white supremacy. We got to dismantle this thing and see each other as our brothers and sisters across the globe. To be in the legacy of Malcolm X, you got to be willing to be alone. Malcolm, when he dies, doesn't have all the popularity, just like King, just like Paul Robeson, just like Garvey. King, he didn't have the support of as many people, but he wasn't afraid to be alone. He was willing to make revolution, not with millions, but with a few dedicated people that believed and who were willing to put their lives on the line as a ransom for justice and freedom. That's what it means to be part of a radical tradition. Radical means to get at the root. So we got to get at the root of American capitalism, the root of white supremacy, the root of inequality. Why don't we have food, clothing, and shelter? These are the fundamental questions that we got to get at. Malcolm helps us get at this. But Malcolm wasn't singular. Malcolm wasn't in isolation. Malcolm wasn't a once in a lifetime figure. He was once in a generation for us, but there are many other Malcolms. We will produce more Malcolms. We will birth more Malcolms. And I'm not just talking about brothers, I'm talking about brothers and sisters. We will create new Malcolms, just like we will create new Angela Davises and Assata Shakurs, new Tanetta Muhammads. We will produce new ones because we must. And we always have. So let's keep building, let's keep growing, let's keep shining, let's keep honoring the legacy of our dear brother, Alhaji Malik Shabazz. May Allah be pleased with him. My dear brother, Malcolm X. Peace, everybody. Make sure you follow Uncle Bobby's right here on Instagram and on Twitter and on Facebook. And make sure you follow me, Marc Lamont Hill, on all those platforms so we can keep building and keep having sessions about the great Malcolm X. Peace. I love y'all.